They thought he was just a rich kid. Until he destroyed their case. The courtroom in Los Angeles was packed. Rows of legal experts, journalists, and onlookers filled the gallery, expecting nothing more than a routine hearing. Pens scratched against. Notepads, cameras clicked, and hushed whispers filled the air. At the center of it all sat Judge Ronald Beckett, a no-nonsense, sharp-witted man with little patience for theatrics. His reputation was built on hard rulings and a deep skepticism of high-profile figures who thought they could manipulate the law. And today, standing before him, was Barron Trump. The judge leaned back, tapping his gavel against the desk with deliberate slowness. His eyes studied the young man, just barely 18, dressed in a suit that looked almost too perfect, as if he were playing dress-up. Beckett adjusted his glasses and sighed. "Mr. Trump," he said, his tone dry, almost amused. "This is a first for me, an 18-year-old expecting to argue a case. Now, I understand your last name opens doors, but the courtroom isn't one of them." Laughter rippled through the gallery. Even some attorneys smirked, exchanging knowing glances. But Barron? He didn't flinch. He stood still, hands folded, eyes locked on the judge. No nervous fidgeting, no glances toward his counsel, just unwavering attention. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Nothing to say? No speech prepared? I expected at least a half-hearted attempt at proving why you belong here." More chuckles. Someone in the back muttered, "He's out of his league." Then Barron spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "I wasn't aware the purpose of this court was entertainment, Your Honor." The laughter died instantly. A few heads turned, eyebrows raised. The judge's smirk flickered, just for a second. "Well," Beckett mused, flipping through the case file, "let's hope you can back up that confidence with something other than your last name." The atmosphere shifted. What was supposed to be a simple lesson, that wealth didn't equal competence, was suddenly turning into something else. Curiosity, but curiosity alone wouldn't change the judge's mind. Not yet. He adjusted his glasses once more and gave a dismissive wave. "All right then, let's hear it. Show me what you've got." No one in that courtroom, not the attorneys, not the judge, not even those watching from home, was ready for what happened next. Barron stepped forward, unshaken, calm. He placed a neatly organized set of documents on the podium, carefully flipping open a legal brief as if he had done it 100 times before. Judge Beckett watched, expecting hesitation. A nervous stammer, anything to confirm his belief that this was just a rich kid playing lawyer. Instead, Barron adjusted the microphone and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to clarify a few legal misinterpretations that have already been presented in this case." The courtroom, once filled with whispered conversations and scribbling journalists, suddenly went silent. Barron continued, his voice unwavering. "The opposing counsel has repeatedly cited Harper v. Sullivan as precedent for dismissing key testimony. However, that ruling was based on improperly obtained evidence under an unconstitutional search. Circumstances that do not apply here. It's irrelevant." A flicker of movement on the other side of the courtroom. The lead attorney for the opposing counsel, a seasoned litigator in his 50s, shifted in his seat, quickly scanning his notes. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Barron nodded, flipping a page in his brief. "Yes, Your Honor. In fact, if we're discussing admissibility, Foster v. Crane would be the more appropriate precedent, as it directly addresses testimonial credibility under conditions of indirect coercion, something far more relevant to today's argument." A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Legal experts exchanged looks. This wasn't rehearsed bravado. This wasn't just throwing around legal terms. And for the first time, the judge sat up a little straighter, because Barron Trump wasn't here to play lawyer. He was here to win. Precision in motion. The courtroom. Standoff. No one expected Judge Beckett leaned forward, his gaze sharpening as he studied Barron Trump. The smirk that had once danced across his face was gone, replaced by something else. Interest, but the opposing attorney wasn't about to be outmaneuvered by an 18-year-old. Straightening his tie, he addressed the court with measured confidence. Your Honor, with all due respect, this isn't a law school debate. The argument remains. He never finished. If you're dismissing precedent simply because it's inconvenient, Barron interjected, his voice steady and unyielding, that speaks to the weakness of your case, not mine. Silence. A single weighty pause settled over the room. The seasoned litigator hesitated, a mere fraction of a second, but it was enough. The energy in the courtroom shifted, subtle yet undeniable. Judge Beckett turned his attention to the flustered attorney. Would you like to respond to that? A long, uncomfortable pause. Then, through clenched teeth, the attorney forced out, I'll address it in my argument, Your Honor. It was a retreat. Transparent. Undeniable. Everyone knew it. The judge, the attorneys, the journalists, and Barron. He merely adjusted his documents, waiting for what came next. Judge Beckett tapped his pen against his desk, the rhythm slower this time, more deliberate. When he spoke again, the condescension was gone. Continue, Mr. Trump. This was no longer a mere formality. This was a test. Barron Trump wasn't just holding his own. He was commanding the courtroom. The battle of wits, the opposing counsel, took a measured breath, flipping through his notes with forced composure. He needed to reassert control. Your Honor, he began carefully, while Mr. Trump's reference to Foster versus Crane is impressive, it holds no weight in this context. That case concerned testimonial coercion, not the chain of evidence. Barron didn't even blink. Actually, counsel is mistaken. A quiet ripple passed through the gallery. The judge's pen stopped tapping. Barron lifted a page from his brief, his movements deliberate. The ruling in Foster didn't just address coercion. It reinforced that testimony remains admissible when primary conditions of influence do not exist. He placed the document down with precision, which is exactly why the witness in our case remains legally protected. Judge Beckett's eyebrows lifted slightly. He turned toward the opposing counsel, waiting, expecting, nothing. The attorney shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. A murmur spread through the room. Journalists furiously typed. Legal analysts exchanged glances. This wasn't bravado. This wasn't a privileged teenager playing lawyer. This was undeniable precision. Barron continued, his voice unwavering. The notion that testimony should be discarded simply because it presents an inconvenience to the opposing side is not only legally incorrect, it's dangerous. A pause. If we start applying precedent selectively, we don't just weaken an argument, we undermine the foundation of due process. For the first time, Judge Beckett exhaled, not quite a sigh, not quite a chuckle. A sound of realization. He folded his hands, regarding the young man before him with renewed scrutiny. Well, Mr. Trump, he said at last, his voice measured, I have to admit, I wasn't expecting that. A subtle shift coursed through the room. Attorneys exchanged knowing glances. The tension that once cast Barron as an outsider was gone. He was no longer just standing in the courtroom. He was commanding it. The final blow, the opposing counsel, unwilling to concede, stepped forward once more, his voice sharper. Your Honor, we're getting sidetracked here. We are still dealing with... Barron tilted his head slightly. If the law is inconvenient for your argument, counsel, he said coolly, that's not my fault. A restrained chuckle escaped from the gallery before being quickly stifled. The attorney clenched his jaw, flipping through his notes, searching desperately for a counterpoint. But it was too late. The balance had already shifted. Judge Beckett exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. All right, Mr. Trump, he said, nodding slowly. Keep going. And in that moment, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a courtroom hearing anymore. This was Barron Trump's stage, and no one, not the attorneys, not the judge, not even those watching from home, was ready for what he had in store next. They're basing their entire claim on a misapplication of Keating versus Burlington, Barron stated, his voice steady, deliberate. A murmur rippled through the attorneys seated behind the opposing counsel. The lead attorney's posture stiffened. That case has been cited in multiple courtrooms as precedent for dismissing evidence under procedural errors. Barron gave a single nod. Correct. But if you actually read the decision rather than cherry-picking citations, you'd recall that the ruling explicitly states that procedural errors must directly impact the reliability of the evidence. In this case, that standard hasn't been met. You're not arguing the law, you're using it as a shield. Judge Beckett blinked, momentarily silent, absorbing the weight of those words. Across the room, the opposing attorney's jaw tightened, his face darkening as he flipped hurriedly through his notes. But there was nothing, no counter-argument that could undo what had just been said. Barron pressed on, unwavering. If this court were to entertain that argument, it would create a dangerous loophole, one where procedural technicalities outweigh substantive justice. That's not how precedent works, and I'm sure the court is well aware of that. Silence. The opposing attorney inhaled sharply. Then, after a moment of hesitation, snapped his folder shut. It was a tell, one that didn't go unnoticed. Judge Beckett drummed his fingers on the bench, nodding slowly. That's an interesting perspective. He exhaled through his nose, considering his next words. Then, leveling Barron with a keen gaze, he asked, "So, Mr. Trump, if we apply your interpretation, what do you believe the court should do next?" The air in the room shifted. The weight of expectation settled over the courtroom. Without missing a beat, Barron met the judge's gaze, his tone unwavering. Rule in favor of the testimony's admissibility. Anything less would be a deviation from the established legal framework. Judge Beckett studied him, his expression unreadable. In that moment, Barron had done more than defend his position. He had seized control of the conversation itself. Then came the moment that would leave the courtroom in stunned silence. The opposing attorney opened his mouth, perhaps to counter, to salvage what was left of his argument. But nothing came out. He glanced down at his notes, flipped one page, then another. He found nothing. Because there was nothing. Judge Beckett let the silence stretch, let the realization sink in. Even the journalists, some of whom had arrived expecting an entirely different story, had stopped scribbling. They weren't just reporting anymore. They were witnessing. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Trump, do you realize what you've just done?" Barron held his gaze, calm and steady. "I presented the only legally consistent conclusion, Your Honor." A slow exhale from the bench. Not quite amusement, not quite dismissal. Then the judge turned toward the opposing counsel. "Counselor, do you have anything to say in response?" The attorney stood rigid, his jaw locked. He knew the truth, just as everyone else in the room did. Barron had dismantled the foundation of their case piece by precise piece. Any attempt to recover now would only highlight their defeat. A long pause. Then, at last, through gritted teeth, "No further objections, Your Honor." The murmurs swelled in the gallery. Barron Trump, the 18-year-old they had underestimated, had just forced a team of seasoned legal professionals into retreat. Judge Beckett tapped his gavel twice. "In that case, the testimony remains admissible." And just like that, the tension shattered. Gasps, whispers, the unmistakable sound of a reporter muttering under their breath. Unbelievable. Barron exhaled, but not in relief. He had known from the very start that this was how it would end. The judge watched him carefully. The skepticism from earlier, gone. What had replaced it was something different. Respect, perhaps, but also realization. This wasn't just a well-rehearsed performance. This was a young man who had entered a courtroom prepared to be dismissed, only to leave it as something entirely different. Judge Beckett sat back, tapping his pen against the desk. The room remained still, waiting for what came next. Finally, he let out a slow breath, eyes never leaving Barron. "Well, Mr. Trump, I must admit, I misjudged you." A few murmurs broke through the silence, but the judge silenced them with a single raised hand. His tone had changed. The quiet amusement from earlier had vanished. "I've been on this bench a long time," he continued, voice measured. "And I've seen plenty walk through those doors thinking they could outmaneuver the law. Most of them fail." The gallery leaned in, hanging on every word. "But you..." The judge tapped his desk. "You didn't rely on theatrics. You didn't stall. You didn't throw around legal jargon to sound impressive. You knew exactly what you were doing. Barron remained composed, but something in his posture shifted ever so slightly. He hadn't expected the compliment. The judge tilted his head. "Tell me something, son. How long have you been studying law?" Barron didn't hesitate. "For years, Your Honor." Beckett raised an eyebrow. "And yet you're not in law school?" A beat of silence. Then, with quiet certainty, Barron answered. "Not yet." The judge exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head with something almost resembling admiration. "I'll tell you this. If more attorneys in my courtroom had half your level of preparation, I'd probably have an easier job." The opposing counsel sat stiffly, arms crossed, saying nothing. There was nothing left to say. Judge Beckett adjusted his glasses, straightened in his seat, and delivered the final ruling. The testimony remains admissible. That ruling is final. Then, after a pause, he looked back at Barron one last time. "And Mr. Trump, consider this your first unofficial law school exam." A measured pause. Then the verdict. "You passed." The gavel struck. Court adjourned. Barron simply gathered his notes, gave the judge a polite nod, and walked out. Behind him, the journalists, the attorneys, the spectators, they weren't just watching him leave, they were studying him. Because at that moment, he was no longer just the son of a former president. He was something else entirely, a force to be reckoned with. Takeaway: never underestimate someone based on assumptions. True power doesn't come from a name. It comes from knowledge, preparation, and the courage to wield them. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. There's always more to uncover, and you won't want to miss it.